Welcome back into The Rundown, a daily podcast where we at CBN News bring you the inside scoop about the stories we're working on. Today is Monday, August 2nd, and I'm Madison Seals, here with a couple of headlining stories this week. The United States is ramping up new protocols and fighting back against the Delta variant of COVID-19, which is proving to be more contagious than the original strain and more resistant to the vaccine. While some are prepared to mask up again, others are refusing a 2020 do-over, and most are frustrated with the mixed messaging from the government and the media. CBN News correspondent Brody Carter joins me for the first time on this podcast to interpret the CDC's new updates for us and talk about what's next for the nation. First of all, if you would have told me we'd still be talking about the pandemic a year ago, I wouldn't have believed you. But almost a year later, we're receiving new guidelines for a new variant that seems even more daunting than the first. The CDC says that the Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox, which I think is an interesting comparison because COVID-19 is a respiratory illness and chickenpox, of course, is a viral skin infection. But I guess the contagion of it is comparable. So are the new guidelines much different from the first round so far?
I really don't think so. We're kind of going back to where we were. They're pumping the brakes right now. So coming back and saying we need to re-implement the mask mandate and also pushing forward with another round of vaccinations, it's nothing new. It's nothing we haven't seen. What was new on Wednesday, President Joe Biden obviously coming out forward saying all federal employees must be vaccinated. That mandate is definitely something new in comparison to these mask mandates, which is just something that's been really palatable for the last year and a half. So, no, I don't really think anything's new, so to say, except for these numbers that we're seeing. Another round of infections really on the rise. 47 states over the weekend here into Monday morning on the 2nd of August. Really looking at these numbers is kind of concerning, at least, from my point of view. It's on the rise again. And then we have these breakthrough infections, which it's not really a big number, but at the same time, people are scratching their heads right now thinking about the vaccine itself. Does it do what they're promising it to do? I think the answer is yes. 97% of people hospitalized for COVID-19 infections are the unvaccinated. So, yes, they're still calling to get vaccinated and also wear that mask in public spaces because the Delta variant is, according to the CDC, it is not like chicken pox, but it is definitely exceedingly contagious, as we've seen over the last year and a half.
So about these breakthrough variants or breakthrough contaminations, the CDC is calling the new variant a threat to both the vaccinated and unvaccinated, which of course is the biggest concern. And we see that in the recent outbreak in Massachusetts where 74% of the infected were fully vaccinated. And at first look, you would think the vaccine was almost making the infections worse or making people more prone to get infected, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but just by that 1%, it is worrisome. And there's absolutely no motivation to get the vaccine if you were in Massachusetts right now. There was already vaccine hesitancy, and now there seems to be little motive to get the vaccine if it's possibly completely ineffective for the new variant. So what is the media's main message to Americans right now?
Well, if you turn on any news outlet right now, they're telling you to get the vaccine. I haven't seen those numbers specifically for Maryland, which is it's frightening. It certainly is. I mean, we've been living on the threshold of hell for the past week and a half or past year and a half, right? This is Groundhog's Day. We can't get away from this. So I think the CDC is saying right now they're putting their faith in science. They're putting their faith in what they know, which is the vaccine. That's what they have. That's all they have, really, is get the vaccine and mask up. That's what they're saying. And I completely understand the hesitancy. I wish I was a scientist to give you the details of exactly how it's going to work and how it's going to save your life and the ones that you love. But I can't do that. I can only just follow the numbers just like you.
Right. And hopefully that's how many Americans are thinking after the first round. I hope this next round that we really all try to get the details for ourselves and learn as much from the past as possible.
Madison, it's a personal decision. This is, if we've learned anything, it's think for yourself, right? As we've seen this, the vaccine it's a personal decision. And as we're seeing, people are getting sick in very limited cases. People are still dying from COVID-19, despite the fact that they were fully vaccinated, right? Now, that's a slim margin, as we understand that. But this is an opportunity for Americans to do your own research, see if it's right for you, and then make your educated decision based on the research that you've done, based on what you know and what you've lived and experienced over the past year and a half.
Right. And I absolutely agree. And yet at the same time, we've seen this push recently from the media for pastors specifically to talk to their congregations about getting vaccinated, because we know that, especially in the evangelical community, the Christian community at large, that congregations are seeking biblical wisdom in this. And there's not a verse in the Bible that tells us what to do. As you said, this is a personal decision that we should make in an informed manner. But people are looking to their pastors for biblical wisdom about this. And you recently talked to Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas. What are his plans to prepare his congregation for this new variant?
Well, he's currently working with the health department there in Dallas, and he's held a number of vaccination parties, rather. He's had booths outside of his own church, and he's been having the health department there so that they can get the vaccination not only to their congregation, but also to the general public. He's a huge advocate for preserving the right of life. He's pro-life. So that doesn't just begin from his standpoint at conception, also to protect your neighbor. He's pro-life from the womb and to adulthood. So getting the vaccination is something that he believes in, and he is a huge advocate for. And now he's just calling on individuals to be vigilant as we press forward into uncertainty.
That pro-life perspective is interesting. I haven't heard that about the vaccine yet, but I know Pastor Jeffress is, as you said, he's planning on these vaccine booths and on promoting that. So is his plan also to try to keep his church open during this next round?
Yeah, he told me nothing's going to change because they never stopped with the mask mandate. They never stopped advocating for the vaccination. So from my understanding, since I'm here in Virginia and I don't really know too much about his church services, but from what he told me in that interview, they haven't changed anything and nothing will change. They will continue to preach the gospel despite the virus. They're not going to be closing their doors, but it is definitely something, from my understanding, a personal journey for whether or not you're going to be vaccinated. But if you're going to walk through his doors, I believe you are going to be wearing a mask.
Well, and I think it's also a personal decision about shutting down your business as well. If anything, we saw from the first round of COVID that shutdowns can be just as devastating to people's well-being as the virus itself. So, with states like Florida and Texas that have been fighting the shutdown since they began and reopening the soonest, do you think there will still be a second round of shutdowns, or do you think states like Florida and Texas will try to remain open for the most part?
I think all of us are going to stay open for the most part. I mean, that's Lord willing, right? With a positive outlook for the future. But we just heard Dr. Anthony Fauci saying that, quote, we're not looking, I believe, at another round of lockdowns, but he is expecting some, quote, pain and suffering because we are seeing these cases go up. So, like I said, Lord willing, there's not going to be another lockdown. But at this point in time, I do agree with Dr. Jeffress about being vigilant and doing what you can to protect yourself and your loved ones. And just being smart is what it comes down to, in my humble opinion. I
agree. Well, I appreciate your encouraging perspective on this and for some of the updates and helping us kind of work through this new information coming from the CDC. So for all of you listening, you can keep an eye out on the CBN website for more updates as they come in. And of course, I appreciate you being here, Brody. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
CBN News provides a faith-based perspective on the most important stories of the day. But it takes time, hard work, and resources. Will you help us continue to be a voice for truth in the media? Visit cbnnews.com/give now. And thanks for listening.
A string of arson across the Canadian province of Alberta is leaving church pastors feeling uneasy because they could be next. So far, 43 churches have been set ablaze overnight, and the community is skeptical about what message the perpetrators are trying to send. CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas is joining me to get into the details of this story and possible reasons why it's happening. So, George, a board member of St. George Coptic Orthodox Church watched his church being burned on July 19th. Can you describe what he saw?
Yeah, it was just, he told me during the interview he got frantic calls right after 3:30 in the morning, missed calls, and finally got around to answering them. It was from the fire station as well as from an alarm company saying that, there was an incident unfolding at St. George's. He made his way down there, and he just couldn't believe it. It was just a stunning scene for him, and this is a special church for several reasons, but among the reasons is that it was not just for the Coptic congregation, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Lebanese, Syrian, Iraqi congregations met there as well. They shared the same building. And irony of irony is that you had people from Eritrea, from Syria, from Iraq, who came to Canada seeking refuge, in many cases escaping religious persecution for their faith. And lo and behold, they come to Canada and, their church, their beloved church is destroyed. So it was the last place they ever imagined that they would experience something as tragic as this. So you can just cannot even fathom the devastation that they are experiencing. They've held several vigils since then. They are in the process of deciding whether they should rebuild on the same location. And also, Stephen Faltas said to me, this is the board member of St. George's, he said they had an incident prior to July 19th where they captured video on their surveillance cameras showing a person coming up to the church and setting a wreath that was on one of the doors on fire. And they, in light of the various church burnings that had been taking place across the country, they decided to very quickly install new cameras, install fencing around the church. They secured all their doors with extra security, extra locks. And then obviously this happened on July 19th. And my understanding is that the various surveillance, the cameras, all the electronic systems burnt during the fire as well. But they're trying to see the authorities have the hard drives and so forth, and are attempting to, according to Mr. Faltas, recover as much as possible.
I can't even imagine waking up and hearing your church alarms or finding out that the cameras were capturing the entire place going up in flames like that. Your church home, the place where you're supposed to feel safe. It definitely doesn't sound like a place where you want to be a Christian right now, or at least be celebrating your Christian faith. A Canadian police officer who is investigating these burnings said that he deemed the act suspicious. I'd say 43 churches across Canada being hit and 10 in a single day in Alberta is more than suspicious. But to add to that, in the same province of Alberta, 3 pastors were jailed during the pandemic, if you remember, for refusing to close their church. Do you think these instances of aggression against the Catholic Church are related?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's two different situations here, and obviously we've done these stories of Canadian pastors who were arrested. Some, for example, in one situation, one pastor in the middle of Easter Sunday, the authorities barge into the church, and in a very dramatic fashion, he chases them out, yelling at them to get out of the church. So the two are not necessarily, there's no evidence that the two are related, but those that I've spoken to speak of this sort of attack on the church as a whole, on Christians in Canada, and those that during the pandemic decided to stay open, to provide a place of comfort, provide solace, to provide a place that people can pray with and be encouraged during the middle of this global pandemic. They did all of the protocols to make sure that people were safe. They wore their masks, took all of those precautions, and yet they were forced to close their churches. And so this particular situation with the unmarked graves and the investigation into what happened to Indigenous children during this very difficult period of time in Canada's history is different, but it speaks to, at least those that I've spoken to, it speaks to an overarching feeling that Christians have in Canada today about how their faith is under attack. And if this was happening to synagogues, to Jewish synagogues, or to mosques, to those of the Muslim faith, church folks that I've spoken to say there would be complete outrage. There would be people demonstrating. Political leaders, national leaders, Canadian leaders would be stepping over each other to criticize and to come to the defense of Muslim or Jewish places of worship. But in this case, 43 churches, 10, as you mentioned, in one single day, in one city. And the slow response, really, by the authorities. In fact, I asked the question of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I said, is there a national task force that has been put together to investigate? Because this is not just in one isolated city or one isolated province, but this is across the country. Is there any task force that is looking into this from a national level? And according to the RCMP in Alberta, she knew of no national task force. Now, again, this was last week. Perhaps something has happened since then. But to my knowledge, there's no national task force that's investigating this on a grander scale.
Well, and as you mentioned, CBN's been covering the stories of these pastors since they made the news last year. And there's so many things going on in Canada right now that CBN is bringing to light, because I don't think a lot of people realize it is not a place of freedom. It is not a place that you want to be as a Christian, or even this is happening in Christian schools and churches across the country, that the Bible, the name of God, is not something that you can talk about freely. There's all these things that are happening seemingly at once, but then there's this event that happened nearly over 100 years ago. A tribe called something like the Pinelaku or something like that found more than 160 undocumented and unmarked graves on an island where a Catholic boarding school used to be. Hundreds of children vanished hundreds of years ago, and their remains are just being found. So what is this if not for a display of genocide in Canada's Catholic community?
Yeah, and that's been the, it has shocked the Canadian public, and as you mentioned, this was an attempt over 100 years ago to find a way to assimilate these Indigenous tribes into mainstream Canadian society, in essence, to make them white, right, and to fit into Canadian society. And so it is a blemish on the Catholic Church and those that served in these schools, in these boarding schools. And now there's just this weekend, there were protest demonstrations calling on the Canadian government to take a closer look, asking the Vatican as well as Catholic establishments that were involved, that ran these various boarding schools, to investigate, to provide a roster, that there should be some reckoning for these churches that were involved and these establishments that were involved. You speak to evangelical leaders, and they obviously are very disturbed by these unmarked graves and have condemned it, and have also stood with those in the Indian community asking for an investigation, a closer look into these events. They also have pointed to Justin Trudeau's comments about the destruction of churches. While he said it was unacceptable and wrong, Christian leaders will say that's not enough. Those are not strong words. He did not call these hate crimes because in Canada there is a law that says any acts of vandalism or arson against places of worship, irrespective of whether it's Jewish, Muslim, or Catholic or Christian, is a hate crime. Yet he has not called this a hate crime. And in fact, he went on to say, not only did he say it was unacceptable, he said he understood the anger that's out there against the government and institutions like the Catholic Church. He said it's real and it's fully understandable. Given the sort of shameful history, he said, of the Catholic Church and its involvement in some of these situations, and with the unmarked graves and running these residential schools. But to say that it is fully understandable, church leaders I've spoken to say, 43 churches either vandalized or burned to the ground is fully understandable. The denunciation is weak at best, and he should have been more forceful. And it took him several weeks since the first church attack happened in June. It was only like the second week of July that he even made his first public comment. And again, this is not just one church or two churches. Even that is too many. But again, that's been the response by national leaders. Canada has to deal with what has happened to these children. 150,000 of them that were part of this program, this process of trying to assimilate these indigenous tribes. And that needs to be looked into. But at the same time, to say that these acts against churches is fully understandable was something that Christians, again, just another example of, who is coming to the defense of Christians when they are being persecuted, in essence, for their faith and for believing in Jesus Christ.
Right. Neither of these horrific situations are condonable. There's nothing justifiable about either of them, of what happened at the boarding school or about these churches being burned. Thank you for bringing these issues to light and for talking about them more, as CBN will continue to follow these stories and continue to support the pastors and the Christians in this community who are struggling. It truly is a sad story, but we know that these Christian leaders and their congregations are hopeful because their hope is in Jesus Christ and not a building. The church is a group of people brought together by Christ, not just a building. But that said, this is definitely a reminder to keep those people in our prayers. That's all in this story for now, but you can definitely check out more details on the CBN website. Thank you for joining me, George.
You're most welcome. Thanks for having me on.
That's all on these stories for now, but if you're enjoying the CBN News Daily Rundown, check out the CBN News app. As certain voices are censored and free speech platforms are shut down, downloading it will ensure you keep receiving news from a Christian perspective. We'll meet you back here Wednesday. Have a great week.